Hello, friends. Did you think that I forgot about you? Well, I didn't. We are ready to go. Lights are on. So let's get rolling through today. We have a lot to talk about. You know who I am, Miss Hitch from TJ, teaching you AP Gov out of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Hoping that you guys are all safe and healthy today. Our lesson overview is we're going to turn a corner into federalism and look at interpretations of federalism. A little bit more skill today than content. So I'll be moving quickly. And then tomorrow, when we're kind of reviewing or spiraling back through the skill section, I will spread out in the content a little bit more. But we're going to be working on evidence, using evidence today, which is why I want to spend so much time on that skill. Okay. I think I skipped a thing here. Okay, no, I have a thing that's out of step, so that's totally fine. All right, so I caught somebody, or somebody caught me yesterday. I don't know where my MFE slide went to, but somebody caught me yesterday in making a big, huge snafu. Oh my gosh, I confused the patricians with the proletariat. So I'm sorry. Don't sit for the AP World exam with my teaching. It's patricians and plebeians. So thank you so much for that correction. I was horrified that I got that mixed up. So question for today from Dev is, what about, how do we deal with incorporating evidence if we're not cutting and pasting? And I saw a very similar issue from Tyler. So that's a really, really great question. And I want to make sure that you guys stay tuned when we get to the skill section or the guided practice section, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. I had another question yesterday from Bethany, who had asked a question about federalism and the coronavirus at different levels of government. And I really wanted to, like, this was such an interesting question that I almost cannot do it enough justice. This is like, I could really just pause here and move on, because if you wanted to see government in real time responding to emergencies, responding to crises, this is a fantastic place for us to start. So first of all, there's this lovely list here from Federal Action on Coronavirus. It's coming from the federal government that has a list of all of the government agencies that are working to respond to this crisis. And it's every agency right now has been consumed in trying to find ways to stimulate the economy, to ensure our continued privacy, to help facilitate communications, to help small businesses, to stimulate the economy. I mean, I think I said that already, but it's truly amazing how quickly our civil servants in the federal bureaucracy have switched gears like this. Like, whatever they were working on right now has been pushed aside so that they can focus instead on responding in a crisis. And it really is every federal agency. And the state, I can't say enough about how much the state has been taking a look at this as well. I mean, it goes without saying that so much of the federal spending is going to come through a state agency in some way, shape, or form, whether it be through project grants or categorical grants or things like this. We will see, we've already seen, so you see this tiny URL, it's a really interesting website to go to take a look at, and it talks about all of the decisions that have been made. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, it tells you all the decisions that have been made by your governor in your state since March 12th, which was the day that really kind of like everything started to shut down. And it's intense, the number of things that they're doing. And again, almost every single agency that is under the state mandate or state jurisdiction has snapped to attention, right? So this is something that it's requires cooperation, and it's a great way for us to build into what we're going to talk about today. And that last thing is intersectional current events. So one of the things that you don't know about me is that I really I kind of step back from talking about current events too much, because it's an unfolding story and I don't know where that story is going to go. And I really don't like looking into a crystal ball and trying to figure out what's happening in real time, because it's conjecture, right? And I think that what we should do is we should have conversations with students where we present the content, we present the past, and we allow kids to move forward and to make their own conjecture, because this is a skill that you are going to have to use as a citizen, as an adult. That being said, yesterday I had a question about whether or not Wisconsin could suspend their primary. And given everything that we've talked about in the past, 2.5 weeks, that there's that single story coming out of Wisconsin is so captivating. It's academically interesting. I'm not going to talk about emotional responses, and it's relevant to this content because it's talking about how essential voting is. It's getting into the differences in opinions between Republicans and Democrats, whether they're liberal or conservative, how they interpret our core political values, how they turn that over into organizing the mandate to carry out elections, how elections are political, how the courts get involved. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's worth a listen to. It's about a half an hour if you're looking for something just to kind of like sit and start to think about, okay, so like how does this connect to what we talked about in class? If Wisconsin do this? Can the governor do this? Can the governor suspend an election? Can the Republican Party of the Wisconsin legislature tell him no? Can they go to the courts? Can they do all these things? And are there valid concerns about protecting the health of voters and election workers? Because yeah, election workers are mostly retired individuals. So just super, super interesting. And I really wanted to kind of show you this graphic, Bethany, to kind of put a cap on all of this, is this idea of federalism. I want you to take a look at the difference in states across the country. According, this is from 2017, what percentage of Americans within those states have health insurance. And it's not just about personal choice in terms of whether or not one is going to take health insurance. It's also about whether or not the states are involved in the Affordable Care Act, and whether or not they've created an exchange and they're accepting assistance from the federal government, which gets into today's conversation as well. And so you can see one of the very real implications of this is if we don't have a unified federal program, there is a lot of disparate effect of, in this case, health insurance, which on any given day is important to Americans, but in the gravity of the situation that we are presented with now, it's even more important because we're looking at a health crisis in which we have intentionally shut our economy down, doing much serious, grave harm to ourselves to be able to prevent people from dying. So this is super topical, super relevant, academically interesting, intersectional, etc. Okay, let's talk about our warm up. So this was our prompt. And again, I'm going to move forward. I'm going to take us right out of this. If you haven't seen this, if you missed yesterday, hit the pause button down there, read it, maybe even practice pulling together an FRQ using the resources that I posted in the description section in the URL that's down there, the tiny URL. I'm going to move forward. So the first thing I told you yesterday was I said, there's two different kinds of feels to the prompts that I've noticed. And so I wanted to kind of share with you a perspective that I have, and it's a recommendation. It's not a mandate, but it's a recommendation on how to approach them and to increase the odds of being successful, to really understand the prompt so that when you sit down to answer the question, you're optimizing your results. So the prompt is asking me to do something different than I have done in the previous prompts that I've shown you. So this is our fourth prompt, and it's a departure from the previous three. So this one, if we go back to it, and actually I think I can go forward. Nope, I have to go back. They're giving us three options, right? Participatory, pluralist, or elite. And I'm sure we could just kind of like roll through this and we're like, cool, I got it. No big deal. Well, this variation is different than the previous three that we did, because the previous three that we did was saying either support or refute, right? Like, give me a reason why this is good, or tell me why it's bad. And that's a thinking skill called refutation, where you're saying why an argument is wrong. It's the most direct, it's the clearest, it's the purest way of responding to an argument, but it's not the only way. So there are some other things that we can do, like we can open up our opportunities here and we can think about it as rebuttal. Rebuttal is something where you're not necessarily responding directly, although you can, as you go through your essay, refute, say this is wrong and here is why. But a rebuttal oftentimes is going to offer another perspective for you to consider. So I look at today's prompt as more of a walking towards a rebuttal, where you're weighing A versus C, B versus A, or C versus B, as opposed to supporting plus A or refuting minus A within the same thesis. So do we see this, right? Again, develop whether or not that's refuting. It's either a good argument or I disagree. I either agree with it or I disagree with it, versus that rebuttal where you're taking two of those options and you're pairing them against each other. Now, can you, again, to come back to this, can you refute later on? Of course you can, right? You can. But they're giving us options. And when I read the prompt, if I want to answer the question, I want to answer the question as it's been delivered, right? So another way to look at this is if I'm looking at our previous structures and those other three FRQs, it was pro, anti, right? What we are looking, it's kind of like pro, anti, pluralist. We're still dealing with the same content, but I'm going to shift here to the other option, which I'm looking at a pro pluralist versus pro elitist perspective instead of pro pluralist, pro or anti pluralist. Okay, let's see how this works out. Okay. So again, this is the one that I'm choosing, is I'm looking at reasons to support either, right, for our rebuttal. So here's what I pulled together here. I sat down and I said, okay, participatory. And again, you know, some students have been asking me, like, I don't know that I can do this in 25 minutes. And I want to break for a minute and say, tomorrow I'm going to do one from scratch with you guys during the practice. The thing that if we slow down and we recognize that you are allowed to use your own work to help support this, right? Trevor Packer said that this is, you can use resources, you just cannot open each other's brains, you cannot share the same work, you cannot use language that's been given to you from elsewhere. And especially when it comes to quotations, like I would never put like long chunks, right? Like a flowing multi-sentence paragraph into something. But you want to like take that language and paraphrase it. And a way that you can hack this is you could paraphrase it to help you study before you get to the test. So sit with Federalist 10 and kind of like go through on your own and bullet out, well, what are the major arguments that are there? And you can use that to help you so that you're cutting down on some of the work that has to be done in advance. All right, so I've got, you know, it allows other people to directly advocate for interest. That's my reasoning why I would be pro participatory. And then pluralist, I would allow communities to compete with other communities effectively, right? So again, we're kind of like, see that language of like marketplace of ideas, people competing. Participatory, we're getting back towards like, we see some of the kind of the core of that definition. And then I've also I've told you guys to sit and outline your argument, and it doesn't have to be full sentences, but it can be kind of the core or the nucleus of your ideas so that you can kind of walk through logically. And then as you're turning the corner to actually write this out longhand, it's going to be so much faster. You can just like borrow language from there that you like or shift it around. It's a more organized, deliberate way, and it's going to ensure that you're really taking time to connect those documents and your commentary back to the reasoning. But we're really just talking about reasoning here. So what you want to do here is you want to make sure that you break this out, right? You're going to take your point, pluralism, and then I'm going to say, okay, so that is, you know, like this is my counterpoint. This is the one I don't agree with necessarily. I'm going to turn the corner and I'm going to say why, because it allows communities to compete with other communities. Then I'm going to restate my prompt so that the founder's intent, so I'm making sure that I'm answering that question. The founder's intent for a stable government run by people. There's always some snippet in there where they're really narrowing your focus into a really concentrated thing. Either it's like based on certain people's perspectives, or it's based on a certain characteristic of government or whatever, right? And then I'm going to turn to participatory, why allows people to directly advocate for their own interests. So I forgot to give you guys a fully written thesis. But at this point, I would kind of be curious to know what you would do with that. So if you want to, go ahead and take this, turn it into a thesis, and tweet it at me. I'll tell you what I think about it. Okay, connecting previous knowledge. Here's what we need to know. So we're returning, like I gave you a sneak peek Monday and Tuesday about federalism. And so we're there again. And I told you that this is another component of the Madisonian system of government, that idea of consent to the governed through elections, the idea of checks and balances and separation of powers and federalism. Those are the four corners in the fortress against tyranny that is the Madisonian system of government. So we turn here, and I'm going to go to Madison's friend for now, Hamilton, who gives us a really fantastic way of looking at federalism. He says that a firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. This sounds like things we've heard before, yes? It's impossible to read the history of the petty republics of Greece and Italy. Oh, that's like some serious shade there. Whew, petty? I mean, I beg to differ, perhaps. Without feeling sensations of horror and disgust at the distractions with which they were continually agitated, at the rapid succession of revolutions by which they were kept in a state of perpetual vibration between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy. And why? And it has to do with how power is distributed across a geographic area. Hamilton really feels strongly, as does Madison, that this is a critical component that we need to understand. Remember how last class I talked to you guys a little bit about how if you go back to Montesquieu, Montesquieu talks about, yeah, we need separation of powers and we need checks and balances, and they're critically important. But then he also turns the corner and he says this thing where he makes a comment that states are supposed to be small, and we're really talking about teeny tiny states like a state of 24,000, right, where you actually can effectively govern in that small of a populace. To him, that's kind of like the ideal, to Montesquieu. And the reason is because Montesquieu firmly believes that a populace, a polity, an institution of government, an institution of belonging that people have, is affirmed not only by cultural things that they have in common, or religion, or economy, but also the environment in which they live, because all of those things are intertwined, that we adapt to the situations that we live in. And so I think if we understand that, that helps us kind of conceptualize why this idea of a compound republic is a little crazy to Brutus at the time, because you not only have one foot in the locality, in local communities, in the people that live in your direct vicinity, in which you have some kind of common identity, or you are in a polity, but you also have a foot in this, like, transnational, huge centralized power structure that is exercising, according to Brutus, some of the most disconcerting powers, right? Economic and defense powers are the things that countries go to war over. Indeed. And so he has a really fair point there, Brutus and Montesquieu, all of those things. So if we go back to thinking about, well, why is this the way it is? The founding fathers didn't want a central government. They were also leery of that. They felt as though it had a propensity to be a unitary government, like we saw in England, had a propensity to be just as tyrannical. And so, and the Confederacy under the Articles of Confederation was just a bad government. And when I say bad, I mean like the opposite of good. Like, remember when I gave you the definition of good? Good is supposed to be like helping people in a moral, upstanding self-government. Like, that is the opposite of what was happening in the Confederacy. It was ineffective, and it was destroying people's ability to survive. So the first thing they do is they're going to, like we said, they're going to break those powers, and they're going to give these exclusive powers to the federal government: economic powers, defense, accepting new states, provisions of naturalization, things that are logical to have continuity over a varied geography. But for things that might be more close in our concerns to the locality, we're turning safety, health, morality, and education back to those folks. because those are things that are really, we want to have close representation on those issues because they're the kind of cultural sustenance of who we are. Now we have these reserve powers that are found in Amendment 10, right, where we are leaving to the state to do all of these things. And then we have the federal government who's looking at the exclusive powers that they and only they can carry out, that are spelled out in Article 1, Section 8, that gives Congress the ability to do all of these things. There's also a system in which they overlap. As you can see here in the middle, there are powers. And the only thing I want to point out here is that they're not supposed to be done in conjunction. They're not done together for the most part. So when we think about maintaining taxes and borrowing, those things aren't blended together because that's a unitary government. When we think about having a dual court system, those are things that are not blended together, with the exception of the Supreme Court, because again, that's a unitary government, and we want to be able to make sure that when we're making laws that deal with criminal procedure and property issues, that you're allowing for representation closest to you. And there's also this thing with common law, which we'll talk about a little bit in a couple weeks here. Legislating, executing laws, providing for public welfare, all of these things. I just want to make sure I'm still plugged in because I got too excited there. Okay. So we have all of these. They are all embedded in our Constitution, our supreme document, the one thing that we've all consented through the ratification process, through elections, et cetera, et cetera. And we see that we kind of have these, it's in balance, right? It's in balance, where we have on one side, if you are more towards a centralized national power, you are going to look to the 14th Amendment, the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Supremacy Clause, the Commerce Clause, as the bedrock, the starting place for amassing power to the center. If you are more into decentralized localities, you're looking to the periphery, and you are looking to the 10th Amendment. So we see this interplay constantly, where the Constitution is intentionally built to arm both sides with the ability to kind of tip that balance, right? And we are going to exercise our interests and kind of try to influence the outcomes, whether they be a little bit more towards centralized localities or a little bit more towards decentralized localities or centralized national. You look to the state governments to help us, through the president, through the courts, and through Congress. So it's a balancing act, and it's a perspective. There's no right or wrong answer. These are all things that there's space in the Constitution for these things to exist at the same time, even in opposition. And your perspective, your take on that is going to be based on your political ideology, the prevailing conditions of the day, the necessity of the issue to the public interest and the common good, and how essential it is to good governance. These are all critically important components. Now, it shouldn't be shocking to you that things have shifted over time. We're going to talk a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow about that shift, but that relationship has altered. And again, if we think about why, we can think of court action, we can think of presidential action, congressional action, action by the parties, technology, all that kind of stuff has all had an impact, as well as times of emergency. And so we often see these shifts towards the national side when we have issues that just kind of overwhelm what a given government can do within a state, right? Because they have finite resources. So when we have these issues that are emerging that overwhelm the resources, we tip towards the larger bucket of resources, which is the federal government. So we see it in the Great Depression. We see it in extreme weather events. We see it when we are ensuring equal protection of law or threats to our national defense. And yes, even during pandemics, absolutely, for sure. So getting back to Montesquieu, there's this great quote from Montesquieu in Federalist 9, where he says that federalism is a structure by which, and they use the words a little bit wrong, so I had to put the right word in here so that you know they're using federalism. We've just changed what our preference is, but it's the same. So federalism is a structure by which several smaller states agree to become members of a larger one, which they intend to form. It is a kind of assemblage of societies that constitute a new one, capable of increasing by means of new associations, till they arrive to such a degree of power as to be able to provide for the security of the united body. A republic of this kind is able to withstand external force and may support itself without internal corruption. This form of society prevents all manner of inconveniences. So the reason why this is brought up by Hamilton is because he's countering this argument that the federal government, what will become the federal government, is just too big. It's just, it can't possibly capture the interest of everyone, and it is doomed to fail because it will just amass too much power to the center. And he kind of says, well, like, none of you states have what Montesquieu would call the perfect small state. You're all too populous. From what he was talking about, it's kind of one of those great, like, sick burns. But he also comes back to say, like, Montesquieu even saw that this was a power structure that wasn't going to be a threat to our ability to be both local and national at the same time. So, do we need to wait for help to help smooth over spots when we need a concert of action, when we need like unity of action? And the answer is, of course not. Now, you probably went through this in class, so I'm going to like step through this really quickly. This is a thing that I pulled together a couple of years ago to kind of really be able to cement together these interactions when we start talking about, well, what does it mean concretely? So many of you guys bake cakes in class and you enjoy Cake Day to talk about federal versus cooperative federalism, or dual versus cooperative federalism. Remember that? Dual goes back from 1789 to 1932, distinct, separate and distinct levels of action. The federal government doesn't really play very well with the state government. They exercise their powers separately. A great example of that would be Jim Crow. Cooperative federalism is where we started to see this intermingling, and we have a marble cake, right, where you have this nationalization of policy to be able to take over when we have these huge problems like the Great Depression. And then there's two different ways of looking at this when we start to look at, well, how do we pay for this? Because resources cost money. And so there's two kind of basic ways of looking at this. One is regulated, and it's a preference, right? So it's not like it's clear cut and we can say it's this time where it starts and this time where it ends, but it's kind of like the number of incidences where we see the federal government making requirements called mandates on the states. Oftentimes they're done without any financial assistance. Things like the Asbestos Hazard Removal Act required the removal of asbestos in schools. Schools were left to take care of that on their own. So if they're looking at having to pay teacher salaries, expanding schools, or removing asbestos, the federal government is coming in and requiring that they remove that asbestos for health issues. So that's an example of a mandate. And then on the other side, we have quote unquote new federalism, where the money is put together by the federal government and it's shipped out to the states with strings attached. And that's a critically important component that I frequently see kids get a little messed up with when we talk about block grants. Block grants, they are like, oh, it's no strings attached. So no, that's not true, right? It's broad categories of spending. So it would be, if I ask you to make me a cake and I give you money, right? There's my grant. I say, look, I want a cake today. It's all it has to be is a cake. You could make me a carrot cake. You could make me a Black Forest cake. You could make me a vanilla cake. You could make me any of those things, but you couldn't come home with pot roast and say that that's cake. I just need to see it, right? It's broad categories. It's got to stick within that category of spending, but there's the ability for localities to be able to make decisions on what that means to them. So it's a really important component that we understand that block grants still have to be spent in pursuance to some policy issue, but there's discretion. So the Welfare Reform, Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, say that 3 times fast, is what we typically associate with block grants. Some other components besides unfunded mandates, like mandates, but we also oftentimes see it, and cross-cutting and crossover sanctions. I think there's opportunities for us to see those actually go under grants as well, but I had a hard time figuring out how to get this flowchart to work, because I'm just a teacher. So but cross-cutting requirements are types of spending where it's required for you to take care of some kind of action, and you will see that if you don't, funding will go away and within that kind of range of spending. So the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is the best example that I usually give of that, sometimes Title IX too. Crossover sanctions, we're not necessarily spending like we are in cross-cutting requirements within a program. It can go external to that, and so it can cross over into other actions. Things like minimum DUIs level, which is 0.08, is an example of that. The federal government threatened to take away highway funding dollars if states didn't pass laws that made the federal standard 0.08. So then you get to, we've got block grants. We talked about that. Categorical comes in, for the most part, we talk about project and formula. Project, you apply for it, you give them, you say, this is what I'm thinking of doing. And then you have to follow through. Whereas formula grants, it's kind of set in stone what you're going to get. But then amount of funding is determined by the number of people who qualify for that. So No Child Left Behind is a great example of that. All right, so I'm flying through that. Remember that this balance between federal and state powers is controversial, and it's going to pit interests and equal protection against each other all the time. And who those interests and equal protections are, it's usually the individual versus the community. So we're going to talk more about that next time. What we are seeing it right now very much so is in times of emergency, we see it now, but it's always kind of floating around in the background. Anytime we're talking about devolution, taking things, getting rid of federal oversight on issues like the discussion of removing the Department of Education, that's another great example of people believing that the states should be the ones, because they have reserve powers, who deal with education issues, and it shouldn't be federalized. Federalism is also about power. And the one thing that is a benefit to us is that it allows for more points of access so that we can experiment with policy when the federal government isn't interested. Especially under cooperative federalism, we see far more opportunity for us to be able to advocate to state and local representatives to try out policies that maybe wouldn't fly at the national level. So a great example of that is the Affordable Care Act. You guys all know it by the name that was supposed to be done and ridicule Obamacare, which Obama was like, no, it's fine. I don't really care if you guys call it that. But before it was Obamacare, it was Romney Care. The state of Massachusetts had the basic structure in place, and it was tried out in Massachusetts first. That is part of the reason why Obama made a pitch to move away from the idea of universal healthcare to this system that you see today. So a great way for us to remember this is this lovely little quote from Justice Brandeis out of New State Ice Company versus Liebman, in which he refers to our federalist system in terms of policy outputs as a laboratory of democracy. He says it's one of the happy incidents of a federal system that a single courageous state may, and we're talking about like state, like Ohio or Nevada, may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. So we can really look around the country and take a look at what our options are when we're dealing with various problems that need a policy solution. Okay, so today we're going to work on our points for evidence. So let's kind of make sure that we walk through this. So again, pause here. I want you to read this prompt. And I thought it was a different one, but that's fine. We'll just go with it. This is our prompt that we're going to be working on today. I want you guys to make sure that you have an opportunity to work this out before I explain to you what we're going to do. So take a moment, pause your button. I'm going to move forward. Okay. Just to reiterate, again, when you're looking at how we acquire points, not how we're organizing our material, that there's two critical words that I want to draw your attention to that you have to see, right? Evidence has to connect to your prompt. That's the lowest threshold that you have to jump over, right? That's our smallest hurdle. Does your evidence make sense in light of whatever our prompt is? But a prompt is a question, right? And so you're supposed to be making an opinion about a prompt. You're weighing things, right? You're trying to make an assertion of what you think is a better answer here. So as soon as we if we're looking at prompt, like, does it make sense in terms of what you're supposed to be thinking about for the question? That's our lowest level. As soon as you make a claim that has reasoning in it, now you want to make sure that you're earning that B3, B4 point, where not only is that evidence connected to the prompt, but it's also connected to your opinion on that prompt or your claim. So please keep that in mind. That's like the biggest difference here. And another way of looking at this is it's a way of ensuring that even if you don't write a claim, right? Even if you completely forget how to do it and you give me 2 pieces of evidence and they are connected to the prompt, you are eligible for points 1 and point 2. But that's not showing mastery of skill. It's just, oh, I can remember these things and I remember how they connect back to this big idea you're asking about. You need to frame that fact in a way so that it logically supports whatever your opinion is. So again, we come back to our argument here, which is federal, we're looking at participatory, we're looking at pluralist. A couple things here that I want to point out that I've had some questions on. Number one, the only place where you are going to name your evidence is when you are in your evidence points, right? So when you're in paragraphs 2 and 3, you do not need to say, well, James Madison in Federalist 10 said that this is best, because that's actually not showing that you understand the concept. That's name dropping. That's pointing over there and saying some other person thought this. That doesn't show mastery of skill. You need to take the idea and put that into your thesis statement, not a name drop of a piece of evidence. Save that for later. Another thing that I recommend to my students, and I'm going to say it again because I think I said it 2 days ago, is that you can use other required documents for your second piece of evidence. You can use court cases that we've talked about in class, the 15 required court cases, as your other piece of evidence. Those are all perfectly fine. And you see that I'm doing that pretty consistently here. Reason being is that it's, in my opinion, right? And again, we all have opinions. In my opinion, it's increasing the likelihood that I'm going to get that point because it's a common language that all of us are talking in. So every kid who's taking the test is supposed to know these documents and cases. Every reader who's reading these things has to know these documents and cases. That's not to say that nothing else exists out there that's a better piece of evidence. And certainly if you can think of something, then you should. But I'm looking at it as you have 25 minutes, you're trying to make sure that you're doing the best you can. You do not have to pull, the most random piece of evidence. You don't have to go up to, whatever this book is and be like, well, this person said on this page. No, just show the skill, right? Show mastery of skill, show the ability for you to think logically. Okay. So returning, there's our thesis statement. Look, there it is. Okay. So while pluralism allows communities to compete for policy outputs with other communities, the founders' intent for a stable government run by the people is best. I've given you a superlative there that says I'm taking a position. This is where I'm standing. It's best achieved using participatory democratic theory, as it allows for the people to directly advocate their own policy interests without losing any nuance. So that is my final thesis statement. That is an opinion. It is an opinion that I have on which is the best based on reasoning, right? I'm explaining to you why I think this is the best thing. I don't have to give you my evidence yet because it's just a thesis statement. So what's the difference between the first round of B1, B2 and the second round again, right? The difference here is that B1 are odd numbered, or I'm sorry to say, the B1 and B2 have to be connected to the prompt and the prompt only, right? They are facts. They can be required, they can be prompted, they can be learned in class with additional documents. You can do all of those things, and you can earn them without the A point. You have to earn A, B1, and B2 in order to proceed through the rest of acquiring points. B3 and B4, also facts, but again, here you've tailored them so that they match your claim. They logically support your claim. You have to tell me how, but they make sense. It's a good point. So let me give you an example of this. And I'm going to use the B2, B4 and say that I'm going outside of our required docs. If this is our prompt here, right? And I wanted to use Citizens United, 999 times out of 1,000, I would use that case, Citizens United, to help me support elitism. It's the most logical thing, right? Am I going to get a point for that if I say Citizens United? If I use that as evidence for this prompt, would I get a point on B2? And the answer is yes. Why? Because elite is in the question. But I said participatory in my claim. The Citizens United, 999 times out of 1,000 times, it is not going to support participatory. I would have to work really, really hard to make that work. Really, really hard. I'd probably need additional documents. So I'm going to say that B4, probably I would not earn that point for Citizens United. I'm 999 times out of 1,000. Okay. Another way of saying this is it seems like if you earn the B3 point, you're also going to earn the B1 point, provided you have a claim. And the same is true. If you get that B4 point and you have a claim, don't you get the B2 point? And the answer is, you got it. That's exactly right. Very good. Do you have to include any facts? The answer is no, they have to support your claim, right? So here I'm again back to the same claim, right? I've got the prompt that we've been working out of and the claim. And here what I'm looking for is I have 4 different pieces. I want you to stop and read them. All right, I'm going to move forward. Stop and read them. Pause your camera, video. Okay, so before I give you that answer, I want you to recognize that when you're taking those facts, I mean, there's so many things that we can look at that are factually true. And every single one of these things is true. But are you going to talk about it's written in Virginia before the Virginia ratifying debate? No, that's not related to the prompt. Why would I add that? Or that assets like property are the largest source of faction? That has nothing to do with the question that's being asked. So I want to make sure that I am zeroing in and drawing the attention of the viewer to just a very particular set of facts. You have to frame it, right? So of all the things that are true about a given document, you are constructing the window through which I can see only the facts that you want me to see because they make sense as it relates to your claim. So with that in mind, the answer that I would pick here is it's C, marketplace of ideas, competition of national level. I have to tell you why I think that makes sense, but that's where I would go, right? Another thing, pro tip. Read these 2 statements. Madison wrote in Federalist 10, the best way to control faction was to force factions to compete against all other factions at the national level instead of small, relatively homogeneous local governmental bodies. That's a fact. The best way to control factions was to force factions to compete against other factions at the national level instead of in small, relatively homogeneous local governmental bodies. That's an opinion. What is the difference? I'm citing Madison in the first one. I'm telling you that this is what Madison thought. That makes it a fact. I can point you in Federalist 10 and say, this is where you'd have to go to find that. But if I just say the second part, if I don't name the evidence, I cannot get the evidence point because it suddenly magically feels like commentary, doesn't it? So you have to tell me where you're getting something from. You have to frame it and say, this person said this, and that's my fact. All right. Name dropping or just saying or providing true but not logically connected points are not going to earn you points for B2 or any of these B points. So I'm going to look back here at this evidence. Does it connect to my prompt and my claim? Again, I'm looking at own policy interest. That's like a critical component to my thesis statement. So Federalist 10, I say Madison thought, we already looked at that. Letter from Birmingham jail. MLK, I told you where. Believed the Black community could not effectively negotiate without local and state government with the local and state governments for basic rights using traditional methods. It required direct action. I'm okay here, but I want to make sure that I'm mirroring language so that I can clearly connect things back together. So I added policy interest because that was a critical component of my thesis. And then I'm going to turn that into a free-flowing written response that you can read on your own. Okay, checking for understanding. Concurrent powers have which of the following effects on the United States political system? A, they reinforce the expansion of power of the national government, supremacy of national law. B, they eliminate disputes between the states and national government by creating completely separate spheres of influence. C, they foster cooperation between the states and national government by requiring that the two levels of government work together. D, they make it possible for the states and national government to simultaneously exercise influence in the same areas of public policy. Which one is it? Did you get it? The answer is C, right? Why is it not D? It's not simultaneous, right? They can operate at the same, they can operate at the same time, but it almost feels like we're like doing it together in conjunction, especially when you say in the same areas of public policy. This is not eliminating disputes. I mean, it can cause disputes. And does it reinforce the power of the national government, supremacy of national law? No, it doesn't, because it allows you to find policy outlets someplace else. Remember, we have two communities that we are a part of. All right. Cooperative federalism can best be described by which of the following statements? A, different levels of government are involved in common policy areas. B, the government must have cooperation from people in order to make legislative decisions. You hear that? C, local levels of government can make decisions on issues more efficiently than state and national governments can. Really? D, the federal government must make regulations that can be applied across every state in the very same way. The answer is A, right? The rest of those, I mean, the government doesn't have to have cooperation in order to make legislative decisions. I mean, what is cooperation? I would be critical of that component there, but I don't see cooperation all the time. Local decisions, they sometimes can be more efficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the reason why we have cooperative federalism. And then the federal government can make, especially since we're seeing work together, and then the federal government must make regulations. There's no like, that sounds very much so like a unitary government, and that is not what cooperative federalism is. So today, despite we're right on time, we're at 46 minutes, and we walked through day 1 of federalism. Tomorrow is day 2. We've looked at changing perspectives of power. We have we've been super thoughtful, and I ended up giving you a thesis statement anyways for our claim today, to think about constructing evidence to support that claim. There's a lot of skill stuff today. Really take your time on it. And if you have questions, please, please, please give me a shout out on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer questions that you might have. Here is your modified FRQ for tonight. Enjoy it. It deals with block grants and categorical grants, and just, have a rip-roaring good old time tonight. And I leave you with the same thing as always. If you're having tech problems, if you're having access issues, please find someone to help find a way to get this information to us at cv.org/tech. We would love to try to assist you so that you have the level playing field that you deserve. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you here again tomorrow at 3. Have a fantastic evening. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay sane. Goodbye.